Jim Rickards. There we go. Benjamin Franklin famously described democracy as two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. And I think it's safe to assume that had you asked the lamb for his opinion, it would have been rooted in one thing and one thing only: his own survival. Now that dynamic exists in the financial system today, as the financial and political deer, which have proliferated in the absence of gold's apex predator, are naturally motivated wholly by self-preservation. If you ask them about the possible reintroduction of an apex predator, they'll tell you in no uncertain terms it's an absurd idea, one which will end disastrously. Of course they will. And this is exactly what happened in the early 1990s when a proposal was made to reintroduce our friend the grey wolf to Yellowstone National Park in order to try and reduce the massive overpopulation of deer and elk which was systematically grazing away the park's vegetation. As you can probably imagine, the proposal was met with a fire alarm. What the hell's that? The proposal was met with massive resistance. Reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone was a ridiculous idea, people said, and would have had catastrophic consequences. Protests were organised, politicians were lobbied, and a great debate waged with very little common ground evident between both sides once again. Now eventually, after an almighty battle, it was decided that just 31 wolves would be reintroduced to the 3,500 square miles of the park in 1995. Now when that decision was announced, the protests intensified and warnings of a catastrophic outcome grew louder. But then something incredible happened. The reintroduction of those 31 wolves caused something called a trophic cascade to ripple through Yellowstone National Park with profound effect. What's a trophic cascade, I hear you ask? I'm glad you asked. Now before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for about 70 years. And the numbers of deer, because there'd been nothing to hunt them, had built up in Yellowstone Park. And despite the efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They simply grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effect. At first, of course, they killed some of the deer. But that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges, and immediately those places started to regenerate. In some places the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, well then the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes. And as a result of that, just the wolves killing the coyotes, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. The rivers began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which was great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks, so that the banks collapsed less often. So thanks to the wolves, the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley side, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge 3,500 square mile land, but they also changed its physical geography. Now, the financial system, just like Yellowstone National Park, is a natural ecosystem which needs an apex predator in order to function effectively. Removing any ecosystem's apex predator can seemingly have no effect for a while, but gradually the system's natural balance is affected, and the imbalances that build up threaten its very existence. Gold was the apex predator of the world's financial system for centuries, until, like the grey wolf, its existence became threatened in the 1930s. In the 1970s, thanks to Richard Nixon's actions, it was officially placed on the endangered list, and today the idea of its reintroduction stirs emotions on both sides, just as the proposal to reintroduce the grey wolf to Yellowstone did in the early 1990s. In gold's absence, bankers have multiplied precipitously, creating new products that are all variations on the same theme: credit. As they've multiplied, they've grazed away the financial landscape to virtually nothing. Gold's reintroduction to the financial system, however it happens, will reintroduce an apex predator, one that keeps bankers in check, one that reins in wanton credit creation and allows surprising parts of the financial ecosystem to flourish. Companies reliant upon abundant, low-cost capital will be preyed upon by those strong enough to survive on their own. The deer herd will be culled, forcing them to change their behavior, and as the effects of gold's reintroduction ripple through the financial ecosystem, its geography will change. The banks of the rivers along which money flows will become stronger, more robust, and for the first time in almost half a century, the balance will be tipped away from those keen to use leverage and make impossible promises and back towards savers, who will once again be offered protection from confiscation through inflation. It's almost as if, technically speaking, the ability of having a stable price has great value. Thank you all for listening.